Hey guys, I'm glad you're here. Tonight, I want you to just settle in. Dim the lights if you haven't already. Maybe pull the blanket up a little higher. We're going to take a very slow, very long walk through a time that was, frankly, a bit of a disaster, but we're going to do it together, quietly. Tonight, we're going back to the mid-1300s. We're going to imagine what it was actually like to live through the Black Death, not as a king in a stone castle, but as a regular person, a peasant girl just trying to survive the day without being bothered by a feudal lord or a very large, very suspicious rat. So let's just breathe, let the modern world fade away, and drift back to a time of mud, mystery, and questionable medical advice. You wake up. It's not a soft awakening. There are no silk sheets, no blackout curtains, and certainly no snooze button. You're lying on a straw mattress that's seen better decades, and the air in your small one-room cottage is thick with the scent of wood smoke and damp earth. It's 1448. You're a teenage girl in a small village in the English countryside, and honestly, your biggest worry used to be whether... Hey guys, I'm glad you're here. Tonight, I want you to just settle in. Dim the lights if you haven't already. Maybe pull the blanket up a little higher. We're going to take a very slow, very long walk through a time that was, frankly, a bit of a disaster, but we're going to do it together, quietly. Tonight, we're going back to the mid-1300s. We're going to imagine what it was actually like to live through the Black Death, not as a king in a stone castle, but as a regular person, a peasant girl just trying to survive the day without being bothered by a feudal lord or a very large, very suspicious rat. So let's just breathe, let the modern world fade away, and drift back to a time of mud, mystery, and questionable medical advice. You wake up. It's not a soft awakening. There are no silk sheets, no blackout curtains, and certainly no snooze button. You're lying on a straw mattress that's seen better decades, and the air in your small one-room cottage is thick with the scent of wood smoke and damp earth. It's 1448. You're a teenage girl in a small village in the English countryside, and honestly, your biggest worry used to be whether or not the rye crop would fail, or if the local blacksmith's son would finally notice you. But things have changed. People are talking about a great mortality coming from the east. Of course, nobody knows what that means yet. They think it's bad air, or maybe a celestial alignment, or, knowing the 14th century, just God being particularly grumpy this month.
You sit up slowly. Your back aches because, well, you spent yesterday hauling water and weeding fields. That's just life. You look around the cottage. It's cozy, if you consider cramped and poorly ventilated to be cozy. Your parents are already up. Your mother is over by the hearth, stirring a pot of pottage. It's mostly oats and maybe a stray leek if it was a good week. It's the same thing you had for dinner last night, and the night before that. Because why change a winning recipe? Your father is sharpening a tool by the door. The light coming through the small shuttered window is gray and weak. It's a typical morning, except for the quiet. The village feels too quiet. Usually you'd hear the neighbors shouting or the sound of carts, but today there's just a heavy, expectant silence. You stand up and smooth down your kirtle. It's wool. It's itchy. It's probably never been properly washed in the way we think of washing, but it's yours. You step outside and the mud squelches between your toes. You don't have fancy shoes. Maybe some leather turn shoes if your family's doing well, but mostly you're just one with the dirt. You look toward the village green. A few weeks ago, a traveler passed through. He looked tired. He had these strange dark swellings on his neck. People called them buboes. He's gone now, but he left something behind. It started with the rats. You've noticed more of them lately. They're everywhere, scurrying through the thatch, looking at you with those beady little eyes as if they know something you don't. Which, to be fair, they do. They're carrying a stowaway, a tiny flea called Xenopsilla chiopus. It sounds like a character from a space opera, but it's actually the deadliest hitchhiker in human history. Let's float over to the local church for a moment. In your world, the church is the center of everything. It's the only stone building in town, and it's where you go to feel safe. But today, the priest looks pale. He's sprinkling holy water with a bit more urgency than usual. He tells the congregation that the plague is a scourge for our sins, which is a classic 14th century take. Did you swear too much? Did you skip your chores? Well, now the world is ending. It's a very effective, if slightly dramatic, guilt trip. You watch as your neighbor, a woman who always made the best bread, stumbles into the pews. She looks feverish. She's shivering, even though it's a mild day. You see her reach up to touch her throat, and your heart sinks. You've heard the rumors. Once the tokens appear, you have maybe 3 days. 5 if you're stubborn. You decide to head to the well. Water is a necessity, even if it's mostly used for cooking and the occasional very brave sponge bath. At the well, the gossip is darker than usual. No one is talking about the harvest. They're talking about the fire in the blood. They say the town 3 miles over is already half empty. The lords have fled to their country estates because apparently they think the plague respects property lines. Spoiler, it doesn't. You see the village physician, if you can call him that, walking by. He's carrying a bunch of dried herbs. He tells you to smell the sweet scents to keep the miasma away. It's a nice thought, like trying to stop a tidal wave with a lavender sachet. But you take a sprig anyway, because why not double down on the superstition?
As the sun begins to climb, the heat makes the smells of the village even more robust. You pass the blacksmith's forge. It's cold. That's the first real sign of panic. The forge is never cold. You look inside, and the blacksmith is just sitting there, staring at his hands. He looks tired. Not the I worked all day tired, but the my soul is exhausted tired. You realize that the social fabric of your little world is starting to fray at the edges. The rules don't seem to apply as much. The local reeve, who usually spends his day yelling at people for being 3 minutes late to the fields, is nowhere to be seen. He's probably locked in his house, praying to a god who seems to have stopped listening. You head back to your cottage. Your mother is crying quietly. Your little brother has a headache. In 1348, a headache isn't just a headache. It's a countdown. You sit beside him and wipe his forehead with a damp cloth. You try to tell him a story about the king or a knight or something grand, but your voice feels thin. You realize that you are living through something that people will talk about for 1,000 years. But right now, it just feels like a very long, very sad afternoon.
Let's shift our perspective for a moment and look at the medical experts of your time. If you were rich, which you definitely aren't, you might call for a doctor from the university. He would arrive in a long robe, looking very dignified and very useless. He might suggest that your brother's illness is caused by an unfortunate alignment of Saturn and Mars. His solution? Bloodletting. Because clearly the problem is that you have too much blood. Or maybe he'd suggest a poultice made of dried toads and lily roots. It's ironic, really. They had all these complicated theories, but the real culprit was just a tiny flea on a very busy rat. The doctors were essentially trying to fix a computer virus by throwing rocks at the monitor. Back in your cottage, the light is fading. The monsters of the medieval world aren't dragons or ogres today. They're the invisible things. You start to notice a weird sort of black humor creeping into the village. People are starting to give up on the old social graces. If the world is ending, why bother bowing to the Lord's carriage? Why bother saving the best grain for next year? There's a strange, desperate freedom in the air. People are eating their secret stashes of honey. They're drinking the good ale. It's a very quiet, very polite sort of anarchy.
You go back outside to watch the sunset.
The sky is a beautiful, cruel shade of violet. You see a cart creaking down the main path. It's not carrying hay. It's the death cart. The driver isn't shouting yet. That comes later when the bodies pile up. But he looks grim. He's just a man doing a job that shouldn't exist. You watch him pass, and you feel a chill that has nothing to do with the evening air. You realize that your life, which was once measured in seasons and harvests, is now measured in breaths. But you're a peasant girl. You're tough. You've survived harsh winters and bad lords. You decide to go back inside, finish the pottage, and hold your brother's hand. You'll sleep fitfully, listening to the rats in the thatch, wondering what tomorrow brings. And that's where we'll leave you for now, in the quiet flickering light of a tallow candle, while the rest of the world slowly catches fire.
Let's drift away from the village for a bit and look at the bigger picture. While you're worrying about your brother, the entire continent of Europe is essentially losing its mind. Imagine a map where every major city is just blinking out. Messina, Florence, Paris, London. It's like a slow-motion collapse of a house of cards. And the elites, the royals, the dukes, the bishops, they're all reacting in the most predictable human ways possible. Some are locking themselves in towers. Some are throwing massive parties because, hey, we're gonna die anyway. And some are genuinely trying to help, only to realize that their power means nothing against a microbe. Take King Edward III of England, for example. He's your king. He's supposed to be this warrior hero. But even he can't stop the great mortality. He loses his favorite daughter, Joan, to the plague, while she's on her way to get married in Spain. She was young, beautiful, and the pride of the English court. She died in a summer villa near Bordeaux. It didn't matter that she was a princess. The plague is the ultimate equalizer. It doesn't care about your coat of arms or how many peasants you have working your field.
We'll float back to the countryside now, where the wind is picking up, whistling through the gaps in the stone walls of the manor house. The lord of the manor, the man who owns your land, your house, and technically your labor, is currently terrified. He's looking out his window at the empty fields. He's not worried about his soul yet. He's worried about his profit margins. Who is going to harvest the wheat? Who is going to pay the rent? He's starting to realize that his entire lifestyle depends on people like you being alive and healthy. It's a terrifying epiphany for a nobleman. He's realizing that a lord without peasants is just a guy with a very expensive, very drafty house. The sun has fully set now. The village is dark. The only lights are the occasional hearth fire and the stars above, which look cold and indifferent. You lie back down on your straw mattress. You can hear your mother's rhythmic breathing and the soft sounds of the night. It's peaceful, in a way. The horror hasn't fully peaked yet. That's the thing about the Black Death. It wasn't an explosion. It was a slow, creeping fog. It took months, years to move through the land. Tonight, you're still just a girl in a cottage, and the world is still mostly intact. You close your eyes, letting the exhaustion of the day wash over you. Tomorrow will be hard, but for now, there is only the silence of the 14th century.
So you're still there, in your little cottage, drifting through the early months of 1349. The winter was cold, but it didn't kill the plague like everyone hoped it would. It turns out that while humans are shivering and huddled around fires, fleas are perfectly happy to stay warm in the fur of a rat or the folds of your favorite itchy wool blanket. By now, the village feels different. It's not just the silence anymore. It's the emptiness. You walk past the blacksmith's forge again, and the door is swinging open on a broken hinge. There's no one there to fix it. Half the cottages in the village are dark now. The thatch is starting to rot on the roofs because there's no one left to mend it. It's like the world is slowly being reclaimed by the earth, one abandoned garden at a time. But let's leave your village for a moment.
let's float across the English Channel, over the choppy gray water, and head down to the south of France. I want to tell you about the Pope, because if anyone should have had an inside track on how to survive a divinely mandated apocalypse, you'd think it would be the guy in the big hat.
Now, Guy was actually one of the more observant doctors of the age. He noticed that people who stayed away from the sick tended to live longer. Groundbreaking stuff, I know. But he also had a very specific, very medieval recommendation for the Pope. He told Clement that the best way to survive was to sit between two massive, roaring fires all day in the middle of a French summer. So picture this. It's July. It's sweltering, and the Pope is sitting on his throne dressed in heavy, formal robes, sandwiched between two bonfires. He's sweating, he's miserable, he's probably wondering if the plague wouldn't be a more comfortable way to go. But here's the kicker. It actually worked. Not because the bad air was burned away, as Guy thought, but because fleas absolutely hate heat. The fires created a literal no-fly zone for the insects. So Clement sat there, smelling like a smoked ham, and he lived. It's one of those rare moments where a totally wrong theory accidentally produced the right result. Because why not? If you're the Pope, sometimes the universe just hands you a win.
Back in your village, you don't have two bonfires. You just have the damp and the dread. Your brother didn't make it through the winter. It was quick, which I suppose is the only mercy the 14th century offers. Your mother doesn't cry as much anymore. She just moves through the house like a ghost. There's a certain numbness that sets in when death becomes a neighbor. You find yourself doing things you never thought you'd do, like skipping Mass because the church feels more like a tomb than a sanctuary. Let's talk about the scientific response for a second, because it's wonderfully absurd. The King of France, Philip VI, was also very worried. He did what any powerful man does when he's out of his depth. He formed a committee. He asked the medical faculty at the University of Paris to explain why everyone was dying. After a lot of squinting at charts and debating in Latin, they released an official statement.
Back in your village, you don't have two bonfires. You just have the damp and the dread. Your brother didn't make it through the winter. It was quick, which I suppose is the only mercy the 14th century offers. Your mother doesn't cry as much anymore. She just moves through the house like a ghost. There's a certain numbness that sets in when death becomes a neighbor. You find yourself doing things you never thought you'd do, like skipping Mass because the church feels more like a tomb than a sanctuary.
Let's talk about the scientific response for a second, because it's wonderfully absurd. The King of France, Philip VI, was also very worried. He did what any powerful man does when he's out of his depth. He formed a committee. He asked the medical faculty at the University of Paris to explain why everyone was dying. After a lot of squinting at charts and debating in Latin, they released an official.
They march into the village square and form a circle. They lie face down in the mud in the shape of a cross. Then they stand up and begin to whip themselves with heavy leather thongs tipped with iron spikes. They do this rhythmically, in time with their songs. It's a gruesome, hypnotic spectacle. They believe that by shedding their own blood, they can atone for the sins of the world and make the plague stop. You watch them from a distance. The village priest is watching too, and he doesn't look happy. The flagellants are a bit of a PR nightmare for the church. They're basically saying, we don't need your priests or your sacraments. We can suffer just fine on our own. It's a very DIY approach to salvation. Eventually, they'll get so popular that the Pope has to officially ban them because they're causing too much of a scene. But for now, they're just another part of the landscape. A bloody, shouting parade of despair that moves from town to town, ironically spreading the plague even faster as they go. Because of course they were. Nothing says safety like a group of traveling, bleeding men who never wash their clothes.
Let's float over to a different kind of disaster. Let's talk about the economy. I know, economy sounds boring, but in the 1340s, it's actually quite spicy. As a peasant girl, you've spent your whole life being told you're at the bottom of the heap. You owe the Lord your labor, you owe the church your tithes, and you're basically tied to the land like a tree. But suddenly, something weird starts to happen. There are so few people left alive that your labor is suddenly valuable. The lord of the manor comes by your cottage. He's not shouting today. He looks desperate. He has fields of wheat that are rotting because there's no one to harvest them. He needs you. And for the first time in your life, you realize you have leverage. You can ask for more money. You can ask for better food. You can even, wait for it, move to a different village if he doesn't pay up. This absolutely terrified the elites. King Edward III of England was so annoyed by this disrespectful behavior from the peasants that he passed the Statute of Laborers in 1351. It basically made it illegal for you to ask for a raise. It also made it illegal for you to leave your village to look for better work. It was the government's way of saying, we know half of you are dead, but the rest of you need to keep working for 1346 prices. It didn't work, of course. You can't legislate against supply and demand, especially when the supply is people who aren't dead, and the demand is everything. You start to see people wearing clothes they aren't supposed to wear, silk ribbons, better wool. The social hierarchy is being held together by duct tape and prayers, and the tape is peeling.
Back in your village, the sun is setting again. It's a deeper, richer orange than you remember. You see a group of young people gathered by a large oak tree. They're not whipping themselves, and they're not praying. They're laughing. They're drinking ale and telling jokes. It's a bit scandalous, considering the world is ending, but it's a very human reaction. It's the Decameron vibe, the idea that if we're all going to die, we might as well have a nice afternoon. You find yourself drawn to them. For a few minutes, you forget about the great mortality. You forget about the empty cottage and the silent forge. You just listen to the sound of a lute being played badly and the smell of roasting meat. Someone found a stray pig that didn't belong to anyone anymore, and, well, it would be a shame to let it go to waste. This is the strange duality of your life now. It's horrific, yes. It's tragic, certainly. But it's also weirdly vibrant. The old world is dying, and something new is being born in the mud. It's messy and chaotic, but it's alive. You take a bite of the pork, and for the first time in months, you feel a tiny spark of hope. Not the big, grand hope of a miracle, but the small, quiet hope of someone who has survived another day. Let's drift back to the royals for a moment, because they're still having a terrible time. Over in Castile, King Alfonso XI is the only reigning monarch to actually die of the plague while in the field. He was besieging Gibraltar, because apparently even a global pandemic isn't a good enough reason to stop a war. His advisors begged him to leave, but he refused. He wanted to be the tough guy. He died in March 1350. His army just gave up and went home, carrying his body and the plague back with them. It's a classic royal move, staying for the glory and leaving with a fever. And then there's the Queen of Aragon, Eleanor. She died. The King of France lost his wife, Bonne of Luxembourg. It didn't matter how many sweet scents they carried or how many fires they sat between. The plague was a very thorough guest. It made sure to visit every palace in Europe. You lie down on your bed that night, the taste of the roasted pork still on your tongue. The house is quiet, but it doesn't feel as heavy as it did before. You've realized that the world doesn't end all at once. It ends in pieces. And while those pieces are falling, you're still here. You're a peasant girl in 1349, and you're part of a select group of people who are going to see what happens next. You close your eyes and the sound of the wind in the thatch sounds like a long, slow breath. The rats are still there, scurrying in the shadows, but you've stopped listening to them. You're focused on the rhythm of your own heart. It's still beating. It's still steady. And in this century, that's the greatest victory of all.
We'll leave you there for tonight, tucked into the fading embers of the medieval world. Tomorrow, the sun will come up, the mud will still be there, and the story will keep moving forward, slow and inevitable, like a river finding its way to the sea. This is part 3. We are moving into the late 1350s and 1360s. The initial terror has faded into a strange, lingering exhaustion, and the survivors are beginning to realize that the world they knew is gone, and they're the ones who have to build something new out of the leftovers.
Herself owning 3 different houses because your aunts and cousins are gone. You might find yourself wearing a silk veil that used to belong to the local merchant's wife. You walk through the village, and it's a bit like a surreal fashion show. You see a plowman wearing a doublet with silver buttons. You see a milkmaid with a fur-lined cloak. The elites, of course, were absolutely livid about this. They hated that they couldn't tell who was a nobody anymore just by looking at them. They tried to pass sumptuary laws, which were basically legal dress codes. They literally made it a crime for a peasant to wear certain colors or expensive fabrics. Because in the 14th century, the only thing scarier than a plague was a poor person looking stylish. But nobody listened. How are you going to enforce a dress code when the local bailiff is too busy trying to find enough people to harvest the rye? You just kept wearing your silk veil, and you wore it with a smirk, because why not double down on the irony? But let's float away from your village again. Let's head over to the royal courts, where things were getting even weirder. While you were getting a better wardrobe, the royals were busy having emotional meltdowns.
Let's talk about Peter of Castile. History remembers him as Peter the Cruel, though if you asked his friends, if he had any, they might have called him Peter the Misunderstood. Peter took the throne of Castile in 1350, right as the plague was finishing its first tour of Spain. He was only 15. Imagine being a teenager. The world is literally rotting around you, and suddenly you're in charge of a kingdom. Peter was a lot. He was paranoid, which, to be fair, was a pretty logical way to be in the 1300s. He spent most of his reign trying to kill his half-brothers before they could kill him. He was famously obsessed with his mistress, Maria de Padilla, and he treated his actual wife, Blanche of Bourbon, with the kind of warmth you'd give a damp basement. He essentially locked her in a fortress 3 days after the wedding and forgot she existed. It was a mess.
But Peter's real problem was that he didn't know how to play the game. The plague had made the nobility restless. They wanted more power, and Peter wanted total control. He started executing people left and right. He became a king who ruled through a fog of blood and resentment. It's a classic example of how the pressure of the era just broke people. When the world feels like it's ending, the people in charge often decide that the only way to stay safe is to be the scariest person in the room. Peter was very good at being scary. He wasn't very good at being a king. Let's drift back to the atmosphere of the time. There was this new obsession with death. It wasn't the quiet, respectful kind of mourning we have now. It was loud. It was visual. This is when we start to see the danse macabre, the dance of death, showing up in church murals. You'd walk into your local chapel, and instead of just seeing pictures of saints, you'd see a line of skeletons leading people to the grave. The skeletons were often depicted dancing, pulling along kings, bishops, and peasants alike. It was a bit of medieval dark humor. The message was, it doesn't matter if you're wearing a crown or a potato sack. The skeleton is coming for a dance. You'd stand there in the flickering candlelight, looking at these paintings, and you'd feel a strange sense of comfort. It was the ultimate equalizer. For a peasant girl who had spent her life being told she was lesser,
There was something darkly satisfying about the idea of a king being dragged into a hole by the same skeleton that took her neighbor. And then there were the memento mori accessories. People started carrying little carvings of skulls or rotting corpses. It was the 14th century version of a live, laugh, love sign, except it was die, decay, be forgotten. It was a vibe. A very, very bleak vibe. Let's float over to England again, where the tension is finally starting to boil over. You're older now. Your hands are calloused from the work, but your belly is fuller than your mother's ever was. You're hearing stories from travelers about a man named John Ball. He's a priest, but not the kind who likes to sit in a stone church and collect tithes. He's a radical. He's going around asking a very dangerous question. When Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman? Translation: if we all came from the same two people in the garden, why does that guy in the castle get to tell me what to do? This idea was spreading through the countryside like a second plague, but this one was intellectual. The labor shortage had given you power, and John Ball was giving you a reason to use it. You weren't just a survivor anymore. You were a person with rights, or at least the idea of rights. In 1381, this all came to a head in the Peasants' Revolt. Now, you might not have marched all the way to London yourself. You had a garden to tend, after all, but you certainly knew people who did. Imagine thousands of peasants, armed with pitchforks and longbows, marching on the capital. They weren't there to kill the king. They actually liked the king. They thought he was being misled by evil advisors. They wanted to talk to young King Richard II. Richard was only 14 at the time. He was a skinny kid with golden hair who had grown up in the shadow of his grandfather, Edward III. He was a bit of a Habsburg potato in the making, spoiled, temperamental, and firmly convinced that God had put him on the throne specifically to look better than everyone else.
When the peasants reached London, they didn't just burn things down, though they did burn the Savoy Palace, which belonged to the king's very unpopular uncle, John of Gaunt. They were actually quite disciplined. They wanted to end serfdom. They wanted a flat tax. They wanted to be free. The boy king, Richard, did something very brave, or very stupid, depending on how you look at it. He rode out to meet the rebels at Smithfield. He stood there, this tiny royal figure on a big horse, facing a wall of angry, muddy men. When the leader of the rebels, Wat Tyler, was killed in a scuffle, the crowd was about to draw their bows and turn the king into a human pincushion. Richard rode forward and shouted, "I am your captain. Follow me." And they did. They followed him because they still believed in the magic of kingship. Richard promised them everything they wanted. He promised them freedom, pardons, and an end to serfdom. He looked them in the eye and lied through his teeth. As soon as the peasants went home, Richard revoked every single promise. He sent out judges to hang the leaders. When a group of peasants reminded him of his word, he famously replied, "Villains you are, and villains you shall remain." It was a brutal, cold-blooded move from a 14-year-old. It showed that while the plague had changed the economy, it hadn't changed the hearts of the men in power. Richard would go on to be a truly disastrous king, paranoid, obsessed with his own dignity, and eventually deposed and probably starved to death in a dungeon. But for that one moment at Smithfield, he was the star of his own movie.
Back in your village, life settled back into a new kind of normal. The revolt had failed on paper, but the old way was dead anyway. Serfdom was fading out because you simply couldn't force people to stay on the land anymore. There were too many opportunities elsewhere. You weren't a villain anymore. You were a tenant. You paid rent in coin, not in forced labor. It was a small shift, but it changed everything. You're sitting outside your cottage now. The sun is setting and the air is cool. You're drinking a mug of ale that you brewed yourself, and it's actually quite good. You look at your hands. They're old now, spotted with age and hard work. You've outlived kings, popes, and rebels. You've seen the world break and put itself back together in a strange, lopsided shape. The plague still comes back every few years. A visitation, they call it. But it's not the same. It's like a tired ghost that's lost its power to shock. You've learned that the secret to life isn't avoiding death. It's finding a way to dance with it while you can. Let's drift away from the 14th century now. Let's let the mud and the silk and the skeletons fade into the gray mist of history. You've done well. You've survived the greatest disaster in human history, and you did it with a bit of snark and a lot of grit. The lights in the village are going out one by one. The sounds of the night are taking over. The wind in the trees, the distant bark of a dog, the rhythm of a world that just keeps turning, no matter who is on the throne. You close your eyes, feeling the weight of the years and the comfort of the straw mattress. It's time to rest. The story is over, but the world goes on. And you, my friend, are a part of it. Sleep now. Let the history wash over you like a slow, dark tide. There are no more kings to bow to, no more taxes to pay. Just the quiet and the stars, and the long, peaceful sleep of the ages. So while our peasant girl was busy surviving the aftermath of the plague and wearing her fancy new silk, things in the French court were getting, well, complicated is a nice way to put it. A total dumpster fire might be more accurate. I want to tell you about King Charles VI. He started his reign as Charles le Bien-Aimé, Charles the Beloved. Everyone liked him. He was young, he was handsome, and he wasn't his father. But history has a funny way of changing your nickname. By the time he was done, he was Charles le Fou, Charles the Mad. Imagine being the King of France in the late 1300s. You're at the top of the social pyramid. You've got the best wine, the best horses, and a wife, Isabeau of Bavaria, who is famous for her love of high fashion and very expensive parties. Life should be great. But Charles had a bit of a problem. His brain was essentially a very delicate piece of clockwork that had a few gears missing. The first time things went truly sideways was in the summer of 1392. Charles was riding with his army through a forest near Le Mans. It was hot. It was the kind of humid, sticky heat that makes everyone a little cranky. Suddenly, a ragged man, probably just a beggar or someone who had seen a bit too much of the 14th century, leaped out from the trees. He grabbed the king's horse and shouted, "Ride no further, noble king! Turn back! You are betrayed!" Now, a normal reaction would be to have your guards move the guy along, but Charles was already on edge. He kept riding, but then one of his pages accidentally dropped a lance. It hit a soldier's helmet with a loud clink. That was it. That tiny sound was the off switch for Charles's sanity.
He drew his sword and started screaming that he was being ambushed. The problem was he didn't attack the ambushers, he attacked his own knights. He killed 4 of his own men before they could finally tackle him and get him off his horse. He fell into a coma for 2 days. When he woke up, he was the beloved again. Very sorry about the whole killing my friends thing. But the cracks in the glass had started to show. And speaking of glass, that brings us to his most famous quirk. Let's float into the royal apartments. It's a few years later. The king is sitting very, very still. He's wearing clothes that have been reinforced with iron ribs sewn into the fabric. Why? Because Charles had become convinced that he was made of glass. He was terrified that if he moved too quickly, or if someone touched him, he would literally shatter into 1,000 pieces.
Of course he was, because if you're a king in the middle of a war with England, why not add existential fragility to your list of problems? He wouldn't let anyone get near him. He wouldn't change his clothes. He wouldn't bathe. For months at a time, the King of France lived in a state of absolute filth, huddled in a corner, waiting for the moment he'd break. It's an ironic contrast, isn't it? The most powerful man in the country, living like a stray dog because he's afraid of his own skin. His wife, Isabeau, didn't really know what to do, so she did what any medieval socialite would do. She threw more parties. This leads us to one of the most tragic and darkly absurd events in royal history, the Bal des Ardents, or the Ball of the Burning Men. It was January 1393. Isabeau was throwing a party for one of her ladies-in-waiting who was getting married. Charles, in one of his better moments, decided it would be fun to perform a dance. He and 5 other lords dressed up as wild men. They covered themselves in linen soaked in resin and pitch, then stuck layers of frayed hemp all over them to look like hair. They were essentially walking human torches waiting for a spark. To make things safe, Charles gave a strict order. No torches were allowed in the hall during the dance. But then, enter the king's brother, the Duke of Orleans. He arrived late, he was a bit tipsy, and he was carrying, you guessed it, a torch. He wanted to see who was under the masks. He leaned in a little too close. One of the dancers caught fire, then another. Because they were all chained together for the dance, the fire spread instantly. It was a literal nightmare in the middle of a ballroom. Charles was only saved because his young aunt, the Duchess of Berry, recognized him and threw her heavy velvet skirt over him to smother the flames. 4 of the other lords weren't so lucky. They burned to death in their wild men costumes, while the court watched in horror.
This event, as you can imagine, did not help Charles's mental state. He descended deeper into his delusions. He started forgetting who he was. He'd look at his own coat of arms and ask what it was. He'd see his wife and ask who that strange woman was. At one point, he even started running through the palace corridors, howling like a wolf. The court, meanwhile, was a den of vipers. Since the king was, well, unavailable, his relatives started fighting over who got to run the country. It was like a very slow, very expensive wrestling match between his brother, the Duke of Orleans, and his cousin, the Duke of Burgundy. They hated each other. Eventually, the Duke of Burgundy had the Duke of Orleans assassinated in the streets of Paris, which kicked off a civil war. So while Charles was sitting in his room trying not to shatter, his family was busy tearing France apart. It's the ultimate dynastic weirdness. You have a king who thinks he's glass, a queen who is obsessed with her wardrobe, and a group of uncles who are more interested in killing each other than stopping the English from invading.
Let's float over to the English side of the story for a second. While France was melting down, England had a new king, Henry V. Henry was the opposite of Charles. He was focused, he was ambitious, and he saw a golden opportunity. He invaded France and in 1415 won the Battle of Agincourt. Poor Charles VI wasn't even at the battle. He was probably in a dark room somewhere worrying about a draft. After the defeat, the French were forced to sign the Treaty of Troyes. This was a massive humiliation. It basically said that Charles's own son, the Dauphin, was illegitimate, and that the King of England would inherit the French throne instead. Charles signed it because, at that point, he'd sign anything if it meant people would leave him alone. The end of Charles's life was a long, slow slide into the shadows. He lived into 1422, outliving Henry V by a few months. When he died, he had been king for 42 years, but he had only really been there for about half of them. He was buried with all the pomp and circumstance a king of France deserves, but the country he left behind was a wreck.
But let's look at the ironic contrast here. Charles was called the Mad, but in his moments of clarity, he was said to be one of the kindest, most gentle men to ever wear the crown. He hated the war. He hated the suffering of his people. Perhaps his mind broke because the world he lived in was just too heavy for a man made of glass to carry. It's a sad, quiet thought. We'll leave the French court now, with its smoke-stained ballrooms and silent, reinforced royal chambers. The story of Charles VI is a reminder that even the highest walls and the thickest crowns can't protect you from the fragility of being human. Let's drift back across the borders, moving away from the madness and toward a different kind of royal disaster. We're heading toward the Holy Roman Empire, where the Habsburgs are just starting to realize that maybe, just maybe, marrying your cousin isn't the best long-term strategy for a healthy family tree. But that's a story for another time.
For now, just listen to the sound of the wind. Imagine you're in a quiet corner of a stone palace, far away from the shouting of dukes and the clatter of swords. The world is big and dark and full of strange stories, but you are safe and warm. The Glass King is at peace now, and so are you. As we drift further, the 15th century begins to reveal itself. It's a time of discovery, but also a time of deep, strange traditions. We're going to look at the people who tried to keep the world together while it was changing underneath them. We'll look at the children born into these golden cages, spoiled and sickly, burdened with titles they didn't want and expectations they could never meet. But that's for later. For now, just breathe. Let the images of velvet and fire and glass fade away. You're drifting down a long, slow river of time, and the water is calm. There is nothing to worry about. The history is done for today, and the rest is just silence. Let's take a moment to imagine the quiet of the French countryside in the wake of Charles's death. The war is still going on, but in the small villages, life continues. People are still planting, still harvesting, still telling stories by the fire. They talk about the Mad King as if he were a character in a fairy tale. To them, he wasn't a political figure, he was a legend, a warning about the pride of men and the fickle nature of the mind. And Isabeau? She lived on for another 13 years, increasingly isolated and unpopular. She was blamed for everything: the war, the treaty, her husband's madness. History hasn't been kind to her. But then again, history rarely is kind to the women who have to navigate the wreckage of a broken dynasty. She died in 1535, a relic of a time that everyone was trying to forget. The world was moving on. The Renaissance was just around the corner, waiting to bring new light and new troubles. But the shadows of the 14th and 15th centuries would linger for a long time, etched into the stone of the cathedrals and the memories of the people. Close your eyes now. The monologue is steady, the voice is calm, and the past is just a dream. You're falling deeper into sleep, lulled by the rhythm of these long-forgotten lives. Let the story carry you away, further and further, until there is only the peaceful, heavy dark. So, we've talked about kings made of glass and peasants who suddenly found themselves wearing second-hand silk. But now, I want to talk about a family that decided the best way to handle the chaos of the world was to simply keep everything in the family. All of it, the titles, the land, and, unfortunately, the DNA. We're talking about the Habsburgs. Their motto was Bella Gerent Ali, to Felix Austria Nube, let others wage war, you happy Austria, marry. It's a lovely sentiment, really. Why bother with the messiness of a battlefield when you can just have a very awkward family reunion and walk away with half of Europe? But here's the thing about happy Austria and their marriages. When your strategy for global domination is essentially a long-term commitment to your first cousin, things start to get structurally interesting. We're going to look at the beginning of the end, or what I like to call the era of the ascendant jaw. Let's start with Philip. He was known as Philip the Handsome because, of course, he was. In the early 16th century, if you were a royal and you didn't have a visible fungal infection, people tended to get very excited. Philip was a Habsburg, and at this stage, the family's famous facial features were still in the mildly quirky phase, rather than the how-do-you-eat-soup phase. Philip was charming, he was athletic, and he had a very high opinion of himself. Naturally, he was married off to Juana of Castile, who would later be known as Juana la Loca, Juana the Mad. Now, poor Juana. She is one of those historical figures who really got the short end of the stick. She was the daughter of Isabella and Ferdinand. Yes, the 1492 Isabella and Ferdinand. She was smart, she was highly educated, and by all accounts, she was deeply in love with her husband, Philip. This was her first mistake. In the world of 16th century royalty, actually liking your spouse was considered a bit of a tactical error. It gave them leverage.
Philip, being the handsome and having the ego to match, spent most of his time flirting with everyone who wasn't Juana. Juana, in turn, reacted with a level of jealousy that the court found unseemly. When Philip died suddenly at the age of 28, possibly from drinking cold water while he was overheated, because apparently the 16th century was a very dangerous time to be hydrated, Juana didn't just mourn. She went on a road trip.
She refused to bury him. She kept his coffin with her as she traveled across Spain, occasionally opening it to check that he was still there. She was pregnant at the time, and she spent her nights in the cold, windy fields of Castile, guarding the corpse of her handsome, cheating husband. Her father, Ferdinand, and eventually her own son, Charles, used this behavior as an excuse to declare her insane and lock her away in a windowless room for the next 40 years. Was she actually mad? Or was she just a woman pushed to the edge in a world that wanted her out of the way? History leans toward the latter, but the nickname the Mad stuck. It's a tragic, slow-motion disaster, and it set the tone for the next century of Habsburg life.
Let's float over to her son, Charles V. He is the man who truly put the Habsburg in Habsburg. Charles was, for a time, the most powerful man in the world. He was the Holy Roman Emperor, the King of Spain, the Archduke of Austria, and the Lord of the Netherlands. He had so many titles that his official introduction probably took 20 minutes. But despite all that power, Charles had a very specific, very personal problem: his jaw. This is where the famous Habsburg lip really starts to make its debut. Charles's lower jaw protruded so far forward that his teeth didn't meet. He couldn't chew his food properly. He lived his life in a state of perpetual indigestion because he basically had to swallow everything whole, like a very dignified snake. When he traveled to Spain for the first time, a peasant reportedly shouted at him, "Your Majesty, shut your mouth. The flies in this country are very impudent." Imagine being the master of half the known world, and you can't even keep a common housefly out of your mouth. It's that ironic contrast again. He controlled empires, but he couldn't control his own face.
Charles was also a bit of a sad, sickly boy who grew into a sad, sickly emperor. He suffered from crushing migraines and gout so bad that toward the end of his life, he had to be carried around in a chair. He was also obsessed with clocks. After he abdicated and retired to a monastery in Spain, because being the most powerful man in the world is frankly exhausting, he spent his days trying to get dozens of different clocks to tick in perfect unison. He never succeeded. He realized that if he couldn't even make two clocks agree, how could he have expected to make millions of people in his empire agree? It's a very quiet, very sleepy sort of realization for a man who had spent his life at war. But let's get back to the family tree. Charles married his first cousin, Isabella of Portugal. Their son was Philip II of England and Spain fame. Philip II was a man who loved three things: bureaucracy, the Catholic Church, and his desk. He was a micromanager before the word existed. He sat in his palace, the Escorial, which, by the way, was built in the shape of a giant grill because the saint it was named after was roasted alive, because why not? And he read every single piece of paper that came across his desk. He'd write little notes in the margins, correcting people's grammar while the Spanish Armada was sinking.
Philip II also had the jaw, and the lip, and a certain, let's call it, genetic sluggishness. He married 4 times. His first wife was his double first cousin, Maria Manuela of Portugal. They had a son together, Don Carlos. And if you thought the previous Habsburgs were interesting, Don Carlos was on a whole other level. Don Carlos is the sad, sickly, and spoiled poster child of the 16th century. He was physically deformed, mentally unstable, and had a habit of biting the heads off small birds. He once tried to throw a servant out of a window because he didn't like the way the man had polished his shoes. He was a disaster from day one. Eventually, his father, the bureaucratic Philip II, had to lock him up for the safety of the kingdom. Carlos died in prison at 23, probably after trying to go on a hunger strike and then accidentally eating too much spoiled meat. It's not a grand tragedy. It's just a messy, quiet ending for a boy who never should have been born in the first place. This is the pattern of the Habsburgs. They were so afraid of losing their power that they kept narrowing the pool of people they could marry until the pool was more of a puddle. They were essentially playing a very high-stakes game of genetic roulette, and they kept betting on the same number. Let's float through the corridors of the Escorial for a moment. It's quiet here. The air is thick with the scent of old parchment and incense. You can hear the scratch of Philip II's quill as he signs another death warrant or corrects another typo. He's a lonely man, surrounded by portraits of ancestors who all look remarkably like him. The same heavy jaw, the same pale skin,
the same melancholy eyes. There's a strange rhythmic beauty to this dysfunction. It's like watching a slow-motion car crash that takes 200 years to finish. Every generation, the jaw gets a little longer, the health gets a little worse, and the empire gets a little harder to hold on to. But they keep going, because to a Habsburg, the only thing worse than being sick was being common. They had this incredible, unshakable belief in their own divine right. They truly believed that their blood was different, that it was special. And in a way, it was. It was a biological archive of every bad decision their ancestors had made since the 1400s.
We'll look at the later Habsburgs soon, the ones who couldn't speak until they were 4, or the ones who believed they were cursed by sorcery. But for now, let's just stay here in the 16th century. Let's watch the sun set over the Spanish plains. The light turns the stone of the Escorial into a deep, bruised purple. Inside, the king is still at his desk. He's tired. His gout is flaring up. His jaw aches, but he has more papers to read. The Habsburgs were the ultimate gold-plated disaster. They lived in the most beautiful palaces, wore the finest silks, and owned the most land, but they couldn't escape the prison of their own making. It's a gentle, repetitive cycle. A marriage, a birth, a funeral. A marriage, a birth, a funeral. Each one a little more Habsburg than the last. As you listen to the steady rhythm of this story, let yourself feel the weight of those centuries. The endless ceremonies, the rigid etiquette, the heavy velvet curtains that blocked out the sun. It was a world of slow movements and long silences. And in the middle of it all, a family trying to stay perfect by staying the same. Close your eyes. Imagine the sound of a lone clock ticking in a cold stone room. Tick, tick, tick. That was the heartbeat of the empire. It wasn't a drumbeat of war. It was the sound of a family slowly, quietly running out of time. The story of the Habsburgs isn't over yet, but we've reached a comfortable resting point. The 16th century is fading, and the 17th is waiting in the wings with even weirder stories to tell. But for now, just drift. Let the chins and the crowns and the clocks fade away. You're floating on a sea of history, and the water is still. There is nothing to do but breathe and listen to the silence of the past. Everything is in its place. The king is at his desk. The queen is in her mourning. The world is changing, but inside these walls, time stands still, and so do you. Sleep now, surrounded by the echoes of a dynasty that refused to let go, until the world finally let go of them.
So, we've seen the Habsburgs try their best to keep it in the family. We've seen the jaws, the gout, and the clocks. But all of that was just the opening act for Charles II of Spain. If the Habsburg family tree was a game of Jenga, Charles was the final wobbly piece that brought the whole thing down. He's often called El Hechizado, the bewitched, because in 1665, when he took the throne at the age of 4, nobody wanted to admit that his problems were biological. It was much easier to say a grumpy sorcerer had put a hex on him. Let's look at Charles, but let's do it gently. He didn't ask for any of this. By the time he was born, his inbreeding coefficient was higher than if his parents had been brother and sister. He was the final boss of the Habsburg lip. His jaw was so advanced that his lower teeth didn't just protrude, they lived in a different zip code from his upper teeth. He couldn't chew. He drooled constantly. His tongue was so large that his speech was barely intelligible.
And yet, because he was the king, everyone had to pretend this was fine. He wasn't expected to learn much. He wasn't even expected to be clean. He was breastfed by a rotating cast of wet nurses until he was 5 or 6 years old, which is a very long time to be the baby of the house when you're technically the ruler of a global empire. He didn't walk until he was almost fully grown, and even then, his legs were so weak that he frequently just fell over. But here's the snarky irony. While Charles was struggling to stand up, his court was obsessed with the most rigid etiquette in the world. There were people whose entire job was to help him put on a hat, or to stand exactly 4 inches to the left of his chair. It was a masterpiece of performing power, while the man at the center of it could barely hold a spoon. Of course, they had to marry him off, because hope springs eternal in a dynasty that refuses to look in a mirror. They chose Marie-Louise of Orleans, a French princess who was reportedly horrified when she saw her new husband. Can you blame her? She went from the glittering, sun-drenched court of Versailles to a dark, somber palace in Madrid, where her husband looked like a half-baked potato and spent his time playing with dwarves and relics of saints.
Marie-Louise did her best. She tried to be a good queen, but the pressure to produce an heir, an impossible task given Charles's health, drove her to despair. She turned to food for comfort. In a world where everyone else was fasting for religious reasons, the queen was reportedly eating her way through the royal kitchens. She died young, and Charles was heartbroken in his own quiet, confused way. He eventually married again, to Maria Anna of Neuburg, who was much less patient. She spent her time stealing money from the treasury and arguing with the king's mother. A real happy home vibe. As Charles reached his 30s, his health completely collapsed. He started having hallucinations. He became obsessed with his dead relatives, even more than usual for a Habsburg. He insisted on having the tombs of his ancestors opened so he could look at their corpses. He'd sit there in the cold damp of the crypt, staring at the mummified remains of Philip II or Charles V, as if he were looking for answers. Or maybe he just felt more at home with people who were as silent as he was. When he finally died in 1700, at the age of 38, the physicians performed an autopsy that has become the stuff of historical legend. The report is a masterpiece of dark, clinical snark. They claimed his heart was the size of a peppercorn, his lungs were corroded, his intestines were rotten and gangrenous, he had a single black testicle, and his head was full of water. Now, modern science tells us that's probably a bit exaggerated, but it captures the mood. Charles II was a man who was essentially dead before he was born. He was the embodiment of a century of bad decisions. And when he died, the Spanish Habsburg line died with him. No heirs, no backup plan, just a massive, empty throne and a map of the world that everyone else was about to start fighting over. Let's float away from the gloomy crypts of Spain. Let's leave the smell of incense and rotting dynasties behind. We're heading east now. We're moving through the forests of Germany, over the mountains, and landing in the middle of a snowstorm in Moscow. It's the late 17th century, and the Romanovs are about to have a very big, very loud wake-up call. Meet Peter. You might know him as Peter the Great, but when he was a boy, he was just a very tall, very hyperactive kid who had seen too much violence too early. Peter was the opposite of Charles II. Where Charles was static and fragile, Peter was a human hurricane. He was nearly 7 feet tall in an era when the average person was about 5'5". He was a giant with a nervous tic and a temper that could level a city.
Peter didn't like the Moscow court. He hated the long robes, the heavy beards, and the way everyone spent their time arguing about which noble family got to sit closer to the Tsar. Peter wanted to build things. He wanted ships. He wanted science. He wanted a Russia that didn't look like a medieval tapestry. So, what does a 7-foot-tall Tsar do? He goes on a road trip. He traveled to Europe incognito, except it's hard to be incognito when you're a giant with a Russian accent and a massive entourage. He called himself Peter Mikhailov and took a job as a common carpenter in a Dutch yard ship. He wanted to learn how to build a navy with his own hands. Imagine being a Dutch shipbuilder and this massive, sweaty Russian guy shows up, works harder than everyone else, drinks everyone under the table at night, and then occasionally remembers he's an absolute autocrat and executes someone for being boring. That was Peter.
He was also deeply, weirdly obsessed with dentistry. Peter loved pulling teeth. He carried a little bag of dental tools with him everywhere. If you were a courtier and you so much as complained about a mild toothache, Peter would get a gleam in his eye. He'd pin you down and yank a tooth out, sometimes a healthy one, just for the practice. He kept a collection of all the teeth he had pulled, because why have a stamp collection when you can have a bag of your friend's molars? Peter's personal life was a wreck, of course. His first wife, Eudoxia, was a traditional Russian woman who hated everything Peter stood for. So he did the standard royal thing. He divorced her and locked her in a convent. Then he met Martha, a peasant girl who had been captured during a war. She was earthy, she was tough, and she could handle Peter's moods. He renamed her Catherine and eventually made her the Empress of Russia. It's a real Cinderella story if Cinderella's prince was a violent giant who liked to pull teeth.
But let's talk about Peter's drunken synod. This was perhaps the weirdest thing about him. Peter hated the traditional Orthodox Church. To mock it, he created a mock church composed of his closest drinking buddies. They had their own pope, their own cardinals, and their own sacraments, which mostly involved drinking obscene amounts of vodka. They'd parade through the streets in ridiculous costumes, making fun of the religious establishment. It was Peter's way of saying, "I'm in charge of your souls, too." It was snarky, it was blasphemous, and it was probably very, very loud. Peter also had a cabinet of curiosities. He was obsessed with anything deformed or strange. He collected preserved specimens in jars, much like the Habsburgs, but in jars instead of palaces. He even had a giant in his court named Bourgeois, whom he treated like a pet. When the giant died, Peter had him dissected and his skeleton put on display. It was a dark, clinical curiosity that matched his personality. He wanted to understand how the world worked, but he didn't have much empathy for the people in it. Let's float over to his son, Alexei. Poor Alexei. He was a quiet, bookish boy who just wanted to pray and be left alone. He was the Charles II to Peter's storm. Peter hated him. He saw his own son as a threat to his reforms. He thought Alexei would undo everything he'd built. The tension grew until Alexei fled to Europe, trying to escape his father. Peter lured him back with promises of forgiveness. And then, well, because why not double down on the drama, he had his own son arrested, tortured, and sentenced to death for treason. Alexei died in a prison cell, possibly from the torture, just before he was supposed to be executed. Peter didn't even attend the funeral. He went to a party to celebrate the anniversary of a naval victory instead. That was Peter. He was a man who built a beautiful city, St. Petersburg, on a swamp at the cost of thousands of lives and didn't blink an eye. He dragged Russia into the modern world by its hair, kicking and screaming. We'll leave Peter now as he stares out over the Baltic Sea, his big hands calloused and his mind already on the next thing he wants to break and rebuild. Russia is changed forever, but the Romanov family is just getting started with its own brand of tragedy. As we drift away from the frozen canals of St. Petersburg, let the cold air settle. The history is getting heavier, the stories are getting darker, but our pace remains the same. Slow, steady, rhythmic. Think of the contrast. Charles II, dying in a dark room surrounded by the bones of his ancestors, and Peter the Great, standing in a shipyard covered in sawdust and dreaming of empires. Two men, two destinies, both trapped in the weird, messy machinery of royalty. Close your eyes. Imagine the sound of the wind howling across the Neva River. Imagine the flicker of a single candle in a Spanish crypt. The world is vast, and the stories are endless. But for tonight, we have traveled far enough. The giants and the glass kings are gone. The teeth are in their bags, and the crowns are back on their velvet cushions. There is only the quiet now. Let yourself sink into it. Let the weight of the centuries pull you down into a deep, dreamless sleep. Tomorrow is another day, but the past is always right here, whispering in the shadows, waiting for us to listen. Sleep now. Everything is still. Everything is as it should be. The river flows, the clocks tick, and the history of the world continues its long, slow, silent march into the dark. So we've seen the Glass King of France and the Bewitched King of Spain, but now I want to talk about a man who was, by all accounts, a very decent, very hardworking guy who just happened to lose his mind and his colonies in the most public way possible. I'm talking about George III.
You probably know him as the Mad King, or the King who lost America. But in his early years, George was actually quite a refreshing change from his predecessors. His father and grandfather had been obsessed with their German roots, but George was born in London. He was the first of his line to speak English as his first language. He was a family man. He loved his wife, Queen Charlotte, which was almost unheard of for a king. They had 15 children. 15! Because in the 18th century, if you didn't have enough children to populate a small village, were you even trying? But George's life wasn't all gardens and domestic bliss. He had a secret enemy, and it wasn't the American revolutionaries. It was his own body. Modern historians think he might have suffered from porphyria, a genetic condition that can turn your urine purple and your mind into a scrambled egg. Or maybe he was just bipolar. Either way, the result was a tragedy in slow motion.
Imagine being a servant in the palace. It's a quiet Tuesday. You're polishing some silver, and suddenly the king rushes past you. He's in his nightshirt. He's talking at 100 miles an hour. He doesn't stop for 24 hours. He's talking to people who aren't there. He's making up new laws for the trees. At one point, he reportedly mistaked an oak tree in Windsor Park for the King of Prussia and tried to have a very serious diplomatic conversation with it. Of course he did. Because when the world is changing too fast, maybe talking to a tree is the only thing that makes sense. The cures his doctors came up with were, predictably, worse than the disease. They put him in a straitjacket. They blistered his skin with hot cups to draw out the humors. They kept him in a dark room, isolated from the wife he loved. It's a heartbreaking contrast. Here is a man who was the titular head of the British Empire, a man who loved botany and music, and he spent his final years as a blind, deaf prisoner in his own castle, wandering the halls in a purple dressing gown and talking to angels.
But let's talk about the spoiled child who was waiting in the wings. His son, the Prince Regent, later George IV. If George III was Farmer George, a man of simple tastes, George IV was the Prince of Pleasure. He was the ultimate ironic contrast to his father. George IV was basically a 19th century influencer with an unlimited budget. He was obsessed with fashion, furniture, and himself. He built the Royal Pavilion in Brighton, which looks like an Indian palace had a very confusing fever dream in the middle of a British seaside town. He spent so much money on waistcoats and interior decorating that he was constantly in debt. At one point, Parliament had to pay off his debts just so he wouldn't go bankrupt, which is a bit like your parents paying off your credit card because you bought too many vintage sneakers and a gold-plated avocado toast.
George IV's personal life was a spectacular mess. He secretly and illegally married a Catholic widow named Maria Fitzherbert. When he was finally forced to marry a proper royal bride, Princess Caroline of Brunswick, the wedding was a disaster. George saw her for the first time and reportedly turned to his valet and said, "I am not well. Pray, get me a glass of brandy." Caroline wasn't much more impressed. She thought George was fat and didn't look like his pictures. They spent their wedding night in a state of mutual loathing, and after the birth of their daughter, Princess Charlotte, they lived entirely separate lives. George spent his time eating himself into a stupor and chasing various mistresses, while Caroline traveled around Europe, being scandalous and generally trying to annoy her husband.
When George was finally crowned king in 1821, he actually hired thugs to keep Caroline out of Westminster Abbey. She spent the morning of the coronation banging on the doors, trying to get in, while George was inside being covered in oils and diamonds. It's a very high school drama moment for the most powerful couple in the world. By the end of his life, George IV was so unpopular and so physically unwell from his lifestyle, he was significantly overweight and addicted to laudanum, that he hated her. When he died, the Times of London wrote an obituary that basically said, "There never was an individual less regretted by his fellow creatures than this deceased king." Ouch! Even the 19th century had a limit on its patience for spoiled royals.
Let's float away from the drama of the Georgians. Let's leave the glittering pavilions and the purple dressing gowns behind. We're moving towards the end of our journey. We've traveled from the mud of the Black Death to the madness of the 19th century. We've seen the ways that blood and power can warp a life, turning even the grandest palaces into golden cages. Think about our peasant girl from the beginning. She had nothing, yet she survived. She saw the world break, and she kept moving.
Then look at Charles II, or Peter the Great, or George III. They had everything, yet they were trapped. They were bound by rules, by genetics, and by the crushing weight of expectations. It's a strange irony, isn't it? The person with the least freedom often has the most resilience. The lights are dimming across the centuries. The heavy velvet curtains are closing on the stage of history. You can almost hear the faint sound of a harpsichord playing in a distant room, or the rhythm of a death cart's wheels on a cobblestone street. It's all part of the same long, slow story. As you settle into the final moments of this monologue, let your breath become as slow as the march of the dynasties. There are no more battles to fight, no more treaties to sign, no more family secrets to uncover. The archives are closing. The ink is dry. You are here, in the present, safe and warm. The history we've talked about tonight is just a collection of echoes. The Great Mortality, the Glass King, the Habsburg Jaw, the madness of George. They are all just shadows now, flickering in the back of your mind as you drift toward sleep.
The world is quiet. The air is still. You have traveled through 1,000 years of human messiness, and you've come out the other side. You can let the details fade. You don't need to remember the dates or the names. Just remember the feeling of the story, the slow rhythmic pulse of time as it moves through the ages. Imagine a large old clock, perhaps one of Charles V's clocks. It's ticking softly. Tick, tick, tick. It's the only sound in the room. With every tick, you feel a little heavier, a little more relaxed. The weight of the past is lifting, leaving you light and calm. The kings and queens have retreated to their portraits. The peasants have finished their work and gone to bed. The fires and the hearths are burning down to glowing embers. It's the end of the day, and the end of our walk through the shadows. Sleep now. Let the history wash over you like a gentle tide, pulling you further and further away from the noise of the world. You are drifting on a sea of time, and the water is perfectly smooth. There is only the dark and the quiet and the long, peaceful sleep that waits for us all. Good night, traveler. The story is finished. The rest is just silence. Everything is at rest. The world is safe. The past is at peace. And so are you. Sleep. Just sleep.